prepared.
I bet. It's probably pretty common, huh? Are you doing a lot of interviews? I know I see you posting like different media sources, podcasts, all sorts of stuff that you're participating in.
Yes. So I did a lot of interviews with this place called Canvas Rebel. I don't even know how they found me, to be honest. They like reached out to me to write down an interview about being a creative, and so I think I did like 3 interviews with them. And after that was done, a different magazine called Bold Journey, they started reaching out to me next, and so I did like an interview or two with them, and I recently did a third interview with them. So I've already kind of like finished writing it. They're just working on publishing and making it live, like to their website. So they'll hit me up like whenever they're ready for that. But all the work on my side is pretty much done. But I'm kind of surprised that they have asked me for so many because I mean, with 3 from Canvas Rebel and then 3 from Bold Magazine, that's like 6 interviews, like right there. And then I also had an interview like about 2 years ago with my own tribe too, where they because my tribe's in the town of Natchitoches, and the newspaper's called the Natchitoches Times, and they made an article about me, like from the tribe and all that too. So I do have like a lot of like interviews out there, and in a lot of these interviews, I talk about what it means to be like an artist, what struggles like did I have to overcome to kind of get to where I'm at, and just talking about experiences too, and just like my general thoughts. So I guess it really resonates with audiences because they keep calling me back. So yeah, but it's been like really cool. I really love the format because what they do is they just send you like a list of questions and you can type them out, and they give you like 2 weeks or something, to type everything out and then send it over to them. Then they'll send it back, ask if you want to do edits, and it's like it's really chill. I love the work environment that comes with it. So it's like something that I can kind of get to on my own time, but I love doing it so much that I do it in a few days. I do it pretty quick and I get things back to them fast. So maybe that's another reason. Maybe I'm just easy to work with in that sense, but it's
Yeah,
fun.
it seems like it. It seems like they can't get enough either. Like those networking opportunities is great. I know I see you all over the place. Let's
Yeah.
see. I should have looked up some more like interview styles and methods. I probably could have sent you some of these interview questions in
Oh,
advance. Sorry about that. But
no, you're
yeah, it
good.
sounds like you're already super experienced with it.
Yeah.
So before we move on, I'm going to give my little spiel. Earlier we were talking about ethics, so that's something that is important in social work as well whenever we are working with individuals from the community. So just before we begin, thank you again for taking the time to speak with us. And just to give you a brief overview of the purpose of this interview, it's part of a community assessment project for our advocacy in social work practice course. And my group chose to focus on the Indigenous community. And we're trying to learn more about the community's strengths, challenges, and experiences. So, with your permission, we're going to be taking notes. I have the transcript on as well as recording. That way, we can kind of summarize your insights. We will be transcribing that for our presentation. Maybe even some video clips if you are okay with that, if you consent to it.
Sure.
But yeah, your perspective is really valuable for helping us better understand the Indigenous community. If at any point there's a question that you would prefer not to answer, please feel free just to let me know. Um, yeah, so, and is it okay if we reference you by name in our project as a community informant, or would you prefer to remain anonymous?
You can put my name out there. That's fine.
Awesome. Your name's already out there at this point, huh? You're just all over the place. This is our local celebrity status at this point. So cool. So cool. I'm glad I got to meet you at the humble start when we were English tutors, but very cool
Uh,
to see that rise. Okay, so just for our introduction, some context. So to start, I'd love to learn a little bit more about you and your connection to the Indigenous community. So if you could start off with that.
yeah. Well, it's a little bit of a complicated one, but I'm what you call a well. First, my name is Shane Lara Jr. I'll start with that. But I'm also a reconnecting Native Indigenous person. So I didn't really know about like my culture or get really connected to it till I was 20 years old. So I'm 27 right now. So I've got to like experience and learn a lot over the course of 7 years. I'm an enrolled member of the Natchitoches tribe of Louisiana, which is a band of Caddo people. So the Caddo people, their area was eastern Texas, western Louisiana, and parts of like northern Arkansas. So that was all of our entire area right there. But I grew up in the Central Valley, so I grew up I grew up very like disconnected, but once I did reconnect like to my people, I also connected a lot with the tribes in the Central Valley, like the Mono people, Mono Yokuts people, the different bands, and as well as like there's a big Pasquayaki population like here from Arizona as well. So I kind of have like a very like diverse set of experiences because I do have my connections in Louisiana, but then I also have like a lot of the tribal community I've worked very closely with here in the Central Valley too. So it's kind of been a diverse experience in that sense where it's like I've worked with the Wukchumni and Visalia, I've worked with a lot of Mono people like in Fresno, and I've done the gathering of Native Americans where I've served as clan elders to a lot of like these indigenous youth that were here as well. So yeah, that's just kind of like a little bit like about my identity in that sense. I'm very happy to be enrolled. I'm very involved in my tribal government like right now. They kind of like sometimes they'll come to me to ask like for perspective, and I've also like done my tribes like newspaper. I've written the historical section where I choose a piece of indigenous history to teach about in the article, and then I'll write it down. Somebody will help edit it for me, and then we'll put it out. And like I said, we're kind of going through like leadership changes right now, so that's been paused, but I still I'm active on their Facebook page, and I make a lot of educational posts for them too, and so I'm very close. I've been to over there before. I've attended their powwows, so I have like a lot of like big relationships, so on both sides, I guess.
Yeah, it's amazing to hear about that diversity. We are going to be asking several questions relating to that, as well as leadership. Almost like I didn't have to send you the questions in advance, huh? You have a great grasp on this. I love to see it. Um, so let's see. So some community description that could be either about your own community, your own tribe, or that of the Central Valley. But how do you personally prefer to identify? So is that by like a specific tribal nation, as Indigenous, Native American, or some other term?
Yeah, I mean, I've been asked this question before as well. I say like ideally, I would love to be called like by my tribe's name, like because Native American is cool, but it's also like there are so many different like tribes, right? There's like 575 federally recognized tribes in the United States. There's 65 state recognized and 400 plus unrecognized, and we're not even talking about all the tribes in the First Nations in Canada, all the indigenous tribes in Mexico and South America. So like I always say is like, well, I wish like because like if somebody came up to me, I don't really say, oh, I'm from the Caddo tribe, because every time I do that, a lot of people are like, well, what is that? What does that even mean? I don't even think they would know that is even like indigenous. And so when I do say like, oh, I'm indigenous or I'm Native American, they'll say, oh, are you Navajo? Are you Lakota? And I'm like, no, I'm like, you probably haven't heard of it, I guess, but I'm Caddo. So usually like if somebody asked me or I introduced myself, I said, I'm indigenous, or I'll say I'm Native American and I'm rolled with the Caddo tribe of Louisiana. So usually I kind of have to start with Native American or indigenous. And I simply say that
Narrow
because
it
I like,
down.
yeah, just to kind of like break it down for people, because there's not really a lot of education just about indigenous people in general. So I kind of have to do that thing where I need to bridge that gap of knowledge. So I'll say native, indigenous, and then I'll say like, oh, Caddo Natchitoches from this nation here. So it's kind of a long explanation that I have to go into it, especially like if somebody doesn't know, because there's been a lot of times where I'll just say, yeah, I'm native, I'm indigenous, and then they'll like kind of assume the tribe like Cherokee or something, and they'll usually mention like more of like the more established, well-known tribes when it comes to that. So, I usually will just say that out of just like helping people understand. I said, yeah, I'm Native American. And I say that because that's a term most people are familiar with anyway. But if it was my choice and people were more familiar, then I'd say, oh yeah, I'm Caddo Natchitoches. That's who I am.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that you take the time to kind of like educate the masses who are unaware, just because of that like systemic like discrepancy, right? Of in the public education system, we are not taught to learn about this community at all. A lot of the time until later on in life, I know I did not learn about the Mono people until I was, I think, attending Fresno City College, like we were talking about
Wow.
earlier. And that's amazing. As a Central Valley native, you yourself as a native to the Valley, it's yeah, it's a lot that we do not learn about the history of the peoples here until really late in life, right? And then before we move on to the rest of a community description, would you mind letting us know a little bit about what we talked about earlier? So that could be your work as a poet, as an author, as a scholar.
Mhm. Yeah, I've kind of done a diverse set of work. So, I mean, I started off as even before I was like connected to my roots, I was like I did a lot of like hip hop. I wrote a lot of hip hop music. I was a battle rapper in high school. I mean, I did a lot of that, and sometimes that did translate to little hip hop performances during the school rallies. And so, as I got connected, though, I feel like my art only got like a lot stronger because I kind of learned where I came from. I learned of my people's struggles, so my hip hop rhythm and like a lot of the lines I would write started to reflect more of my background as an indigenous person. And this was like actually right before I became a tutor as well, because I had been a college dropout. I dropped out after 2 semesters when I was 18, 19 years old. I came back a few years later, and I was still doing my hip hop performances. And an English professor approached me. Her name was Kristen Norton, and she basically said, "Well, like you're so good, why don't you do a poetry slam?" And I was like, okay, I'll do a poetry slam. I'm like, I'm not really a poet, I'm a rapper. She was like, oh, same thing. You'll do it. And I walk into this venue in Visalia called Loudmouth Poetry Jam. I didn't know anybody whatsoever, but I performed and I won first place in the first ever poetry slam competition I ever did. And I didn't even know what that meant. And everybody was hyping me up. And I'm like, what? I just won first place. No big deal. And they're like, oh, yeah, we're going to send you to Florida or whatever. I'm like, Florida? Why am I going to Florida? He's like, because there's a national poetry competition that you can do, and you're the champion now, and you're the team leader. And I'm like, all right, I guess I'm doing that. So I traveled a lot and I wrote a lot of slam poetry to represent indigenous people because I rarely ever saw an indigenous person on the poetry scene. And that eventually translated to me writing like novels as well, because within hip hop, within slam poetry, within novel writing and writing in general, there is a lack of an indigenous perspective. So a lot of my work circles around representing like native stories and representing that modern native like perspective, and just talking about like the history and talking about colonialism. A lot of my work touches on those things. And so I would say that my work is mainly focused on showing the world that indigenous people are human beings. Like we're not gone, we're not extinct, we're still here, and we're still here as people existing in the modern day. So it's kind of like a big summary. My work stretches out like in many different areas, but that's like the main purpose of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know we discussed this before recording, but I would love for you to plug your book as well, your books.
Yes. So I released my first novel in February of 2025, and it's called Four Directions Through Fire, and it is of the post-apocalyptic genre, but it's from a Native American perspective. And so it is like my first attempt at a novel. It's not my most polished work, but the Native community really like loved it. I sold about 60 copies, because I purchased some physical copies and I sold out like out of all of them. Everybody wanted to read it and they told me like a lot of good things. And, the story's kind of about it actually takes place in the Central Valley, but it takes place 20 years after like a nuclear like apocalypse. And the main character is basically trying to like preserve culture in the aftermath of all of that. And so he has to protect him and his like two daughters that he has from like, outside people that want to like take advantage or take over. But he's also trying to form a community in that environment. And in a way, it's like after like all of that destruction, it's almost like the earth is kind of like returning to what it was before colonialism destroyed it all. But while he's trying to like kind of like bring it back to like a pre-colonial thing to treat Mother Earth better, there are still other people that still have a colonial mindset and are wanting to take. So there's like a lot of like conflict within that book, and there's a lot of like discussions between the Western way of thinking and the indigenous way of thinking. And it's like a very like deep story. I take a lot of elements of my personal life and I kind of sprinkle it like throughout that story too. So it's very nice. And my other book, Good Medicine, is a children's book that I made, which represents the struggle with Native kids going through COVID-19 lockdowns. And as I mentioned earlier, as Indigenous people, community is important to us. That's like, our therapy. That's like our medicine. And when that happened, for a lot of kids, they're kind of like disconnected from that. Or if they wanted to attend anything cultural, it had to be over a Zoom, and they couldn't really like be out there. So I write about that in a children's book perspective too, and I talk about that. So it was really fun to make that with a small team. I think we made that book in like 2 months. Like we were working really hard with it. So yeah, I loved it.
That is so amazing just to hear those descriptions. And, although fiction, obviously, with your novel, you can see a lot of parallels to reality,
Oh yeah.
right? That Western perspective that does tend to overtake a lot of other perspectives, forcing
Mhm.
people out. So yeah, I cannot wait to get my hands on that book as well. Are you still selling copies?
Um, yes. So I have digital copies on Amazon Kindle. So if you have a Kindle account, you can read
I
it like
sure
for free.
do.
Yeah, okay. Well, you can read it for free. Then yeah, I'll have to send you like a link. And for physical copies, like I said, physical copies are kind of like very expensive. So if people want some, they would just have to let me know ahead of time, and then I can like put in an order and sell it off. So if anyone wants a physical copy, they would just have to reach out to me directly and just say, hey, like, can you get me a physical copy? I'll pay like the cost of it. Because like I said, printing, the only thing that's preventing me from releasing more novels is just the expenses of publishing and editing and things like that. Because I have literally like 4 novels that are already done. It's just I'm waiting to kind of get a little bit more secure on my end to be able to fund putting like all of those projects out. But I have a lot of things that are resting. So once I kind of get stable with my program and all that, I'm going to be putting out even more stuff too. But yeah, Amazon Kindle, you can read it for free. I mean, if anyone wants to purchase it, they can read, I think, like the first 3 chapters to see if they like it, and then yeah, it's out there for everybody. Anybody can read it.
Yeah, absolutely. I do have that Kindle Unlimited, so I will be looking for that link as soon as we're done with this interview. But you mentioned kind of waiting until a little bit in the future because of some of those barriers of
Yeah.
publication. But from what we talked about earlier, it sounds like your scholarship may be lowering some of those barriers, right? Do you want to talk a little bit about what we discussed earlier with Fresno City College?
Yes. Yeah. So for like context, I'm online master's program with Arizona State University. So the program I'm under is Native American education or Indigenous education. And so essentially, it's like we learn about the Native American perspective of like research, education in general. We learn about the history of what education was to us and how Western education was inherently violent. So that was our first experience with Western education. So it's like that. A lot of my work kind of revolves around like the decolonial perspective and also acknowledging that Native knowledge systems are just as equal to Western knowledge systems, where Western knowledge systems kind of exist in an area of absolute truth where my way is the only way of understanding and everything else is wrong. And so Indigenous education pushes back and saying like we have valuable perspectives on research just as much as the Western one is. And so it's really cool because an opportunity has come up because Fresno City College is currently hiring a new Native American Studies like professor, and so I have applied for that. Even though I don't have a master's degree, a lot of like the community were encouraging me and saying, well, you can just argue for equivalencies. Like we've seen you do poetry readings, we've seen you do academic presentations at Reedley College. I've even done equity labs at Fresno City College, educating the professors about Native history. So all of them are like, you're already doing the work. It's like you're almost done with your education. You're doing the community work already, so you are more than qualified for equivalency. And so a lot of Native American studies departments, they're still very small, especially like in the Central Valley. So like right now, they've only had probably one Native American studies professor at a time. And so now they're finally going to hire like a second one to offer more courses to the students there and more courses to like anybody who wants to expand their knowledge in Indigenous studies as well. So I've recently got all my letters of recommendation. It was a long application. It was crazy, but I've submitted it, and now they're hoping to pick somebody like before the summer comes around. So it's just we got to see. I'm not sure who else is applying, but I've been encouraged to do that. And if I do, it'll be a really huge role because it's just not just teaching, but building relationships with the community too. That's a very important role, especially just like within Indigenous departments. Community is the most important thing. Relationship is the most important thing, and reciprocity too. So it's like really huge. I'm excited. I hope I do get it. And they even tell me, even if you don't get it, he's like, you still have that experience and you know how the system works. If you go through the interview and you do a teaching demonstration, because that's what I'm going to have to do, a teaching demonstration, then, interview with the chancellor and a lot of higher up people if I move forward in that way. And they say, even if you don't get it, that experience is valuable. So just go for it. And a lot of the people in the community saying, just go for it and see what happens. So I'm excited, either way it goes down, it's a learning experience.
Yeah, that sounds like an amazing opportunity. And it's interesting that you're discussing these opportunities for you to discuss equity, right? At the colleges because of like these Western structures that we already have set up that often do not value Indigenous voices. Something that we talk about in social work that is very important to our field is, viewing our clients as the experts in their own lives, in their own experiences, and their own knowledge. But what we often see is this kind of hierarchy where, just like you said, our way is the right way, and kind of paternalistic as well, where we are telling other people, this is the way that we do things, without really taking their perspective into consideration. And it sounds like that's something that you're actually dealing with, even in this role as becoming an instructor at Fresno City College. Is even though you have that experience, you have that, that knowledge, that lived experience with your community, you still have to go through the system that is already set up, right? So I love that your community is encouraging you that, even if you're don't have uh, that master's degree quite yet, because I know you said it's coming up soon, right? But
Right.
yeah, but take that chance anyways, right? We're trying to kind of dismantle these structures that are saying that this specific way is superior, so that's a great opportunity. But I'm gonna go ahead and open the floor to Casey so she could ask you some questions as well. But I kind of had to ramble on just because your own story is so interesting. Before we can even delve into the rest of these questions, I just had to know. So thank you for sharing that. But go ahead, Casey.
Yeah, I want to say congratulations and good luck.
Thank you.
Okay, so from your perspective, what does the Indigenous community look like today?
From my perspective, to me, I think the indigenous community today looks like to me is I would say like successful. And when I define successful, I kind of define it as seeing a lot of like native people in like in big positions of like community power. So for example, there's like services like Fresno American Indian Health Project in Fresno. And so they actually host a gathering of Native Americans where young teenage Native youth can go up to a camp like for a week, like with different community members and learning about indigenous culture, learning about indigenous history. And so like there are like ongoing like achievements. And the Fresno American Indian Health Project kind of started off as like a small building, and they shared a building with a bunch of other services, and they recently bought like the whole thing. So they have medical services, they have youth services, administrative services as well, and also just the growth of like Native American studies, like just within like Fresno State and Fresno City College, and also Reedley too, because Reedley recently got a new Native American studies like professor as well. And so, I mean, it's still like a very like slow grind. I mean, I feel like we're barely getting the opportunities to really like grow, to like show that our like ways of understanding is like legitimate. So I guess like maybe even like more accurate, what I would say that like I see it as like we're growing right now, because even in my tribe of the Natchitoches people, we only got state recognition in 2017. So like as a tribe, we were badly displaced. And so in the 90s, a lot of the descendants got together and they started doing research. Early 2000s, they continued doing that. And in 2015, they finally created a council and they petitioned the state of Louisiana to like acknowledge that they are a tribe with history. And the state of Louisiana did that in 2017. And so, I mean, we're still kind of like going through leadership changes. I mean, there was like a little bit of like intertribal conflict that was there. And however, even past that, you know, we're trying to like relearn language. We're trying to bring in these like resources to try to understand like culture a lot better. And the most importantly is like learning that indigenous mindset and learning how to like view the world through an indigenous lens rather than simply just a Western lens. So there is just like a lot of growth there. And I'll even go even further to say, even in media, for example, I mean, we have shows like Reservation Dogs and Dark Winds, where previously we didn't have any shows representing that or having an indigenous character as the main character going forward or something representing the community. And Killers of the Flower Moon with Lily Gladstone is another example in that area. So there is like a lot of growth that is happening. I feel like there should be more, like we should be having more opportunities like in all of those areas, but I will say it's growing. Like there's a long way to go, I will say, but I do acknowledge that there's progress being made and there are things being seen that previous generations weren't able to see whatsoever. So I think we're like in the middle of that transition.
Yeah, that's oh,
Sorry,
sorry, go ahead, Casey.
Brianna's really good with like, anyways, I just ask the questions. Okay, so what tribes or cultural groups are represented locally? I think you kind of answered it, though.
Yeah, I mean, just like there's like different bands of like Mono people, of course,
Mhm.
Yokuts people. There's also like the Wachumni people, like Thule people, kind of like all in the Central Valley, and also you have like some tribes who have settled. And as I kind of mentioned earlier before the interview, there's a big Yaqui population as well, which the Yaqui people come from like Arizona, parts of Texas, and Sonora, Mexico. So there's like a big like Yaqui population over there, like so big that like the tribe actually comes down to Fresno to help like people register if they're not enrolled with the tribe, or it's like they tell them about events happening in Arizona or things going on with the tribe, like decisions and moving forward. So there's like a really like big element to that. But I would say like yeah, a lot of like the Mono people are very dominant, and Wukchumni as well are like all like you know very like big in that community, and a lot of the leaders like come from those nations. I mean, we have like some people also coming down from like Southern California, like Tongva people as well. There's a small population there. But yeah, the homelands of the Yokuts and Mono people, I would say, is like the biggest, and they've like done like a lot of work as well. So, for example, they had this area called Squaw Valley, in which squaw is a very derogatory term for indigenous people. And the tribes in the area were able to push for a change of the name, and now it's called Yokuts Valley. So, yeah, a lot of like good work there.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. And great to hear about some of those successes in the community, whether renaming or media representation. I was going to ask about the diversity of the Indigenous community here, in terms of tribal representation, culture experiences, but it sounds like you already answered that. So we'll shift a little bit. I'd like to talk about some of the issues that Indigenous communities may be facing today. And that could be here in the Valley, that could be with your own tribe, just any information that you want to share about that.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I would say like sometimes it's just like the access of like information. Like what I've noticed here too is that there have been indigenous people who like, you know, live on the rancherias or live like on their traditional lands, and they'll come to like places like Fresno City College or Fresno State, and some of them are unaware of like the programming, you know, and like some of them will come here and they don't even know that there is an indigenous clubs, or you know like you can get a master's like within the study. And so I'll give another example too. Like my wife went to UC Merced, and they didn't even have like an operating like club whatsoever, and they had never had their own specialized graduation. So my wife literally had to go over there, help start up the club with the help of some other people that she brought with her. And then, you know, they had to basically like ask the college to like, we want a graduation. And it was crazy because they had to like really like kind of push for it because they wanted to schedule their graduation on like a Mother's Day weekend, like way earlier than all the other graduations. And so there had to be a push for that. there was also like they kept on like trying to contact people about those issues, and every time they would go, the person wouldn't be in the office, or there wouldn't be a point of like communication. So sometimes it's like they like sometimes people try to say that there is not enough of us on the college to justify a need for resources, but the problem is the reason why there isn't like there we're such a low population is just because of the that historical aspect of like the attempted genocide on indigenous people. So a lot of us who are like in the urban areas, our populations are very low. So it's like we're never going to have like that population justification. And it's not because, not enough of us are going to school. It's just that the history has affected us. And some of us aren't aware of the access to the resources as well. So when we ask for things, they're like, well, there's not enough people to justify it. So why do we need to do it? And it's like very like ignorant too. And I don't know if you're like familiar with this, but if somebody's like going to register for college and they fill out like the survey and say what their ethnicity is, if they say I'm native and I'm mixed with this, or native like mixed with like white or something, they will not count that as a native population like whatsoever. So unless like you mark that you're fully native, then they're not going to count you as native. And that's an issue that has happened. And I've even spoken to the person at the College of the Sequoias as well. And he said, yeah, he goes, it said we had a low population, but when I added people who also said they were native and mixed, the population got a lot bigger. So it's a lot of like weird westernized systems that tend to affect the community.
Yeah,
You know,
that
where
damn census data is always going to be an issue. That's something I talk about with my husband, who never quite knows how to answer those census questions. He is Mexican, but he is also indigenous, and he never knows which box to check, right? So that's something that we've definitely seen as a lot of those demographic issues. So it sounds like a lot of internal community assets, but limited resources just in the wider community. Some issues of cultural erasure, right? Lack of equal access to opportunities, as well as those
yeah, and
census issues.
I'll do a quick correction because my wife just corrected me right now. She said there was a native like there was like a club, but there wasn't like a program like whatsoever. So the club wasn't really. I mean, it was there, but they kind of needed to build it up more. So just had to do that correction because she whispered in my ear right now. So I was like, oh, okay,
I appreciate the live fact checking. Great to see.
yes. She makes sure of that.
Okay, Casey.
She's keeping you on your toes.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. So are there resources or services that Indigenous communities struggle to access, such as healthcare, education, housing, or cultural support?
Yeah, I would say just of course, like even within like I said, indigenous studies programs, like there is a lack of like upper division courses. So a problem that I ran to at Fresno State and others did is that, we wanted to major within Native American studies. We wanted to major within that. However, what Fresno State did is they took all of the ethnic studies and they labeled it interdisciplinary studies. They all put it under one broad title. And they told me, they're like, well, listen, it's not going to say indigenous studies on your diploma. It's just going to say interdisciplinary studies because they just want to put a blanket term over the whole thing. And like also you need to merge your indigenous studies degree with another major. And I said, well, why? He's like, because we don't have enough upper division courses like to justify an entire major. So it's kind of like that thing where, so I ended up having to merge mine with sociology. And then it wasn't even called indigenous studies. However, I could say emphasis on indigenous studies. And that program was only built like a few years ago. So before that, there wasn't even really an established program. Even at like Fresno City College, they've established like a good Native Studies program, but it's because there was somebody in the community that saw the need and pushed for it. So oftentimes what happens is if we don't have somebody representing or pushing it forward for us, the program is just going to stagnate like completely. And like I mentioned, we only have like one professor at Fresno City College. If something were to happen or if you were just like to leave, it was like, well, who's going to like take that person's spot? Because, Native people, even nationally, it's like, we have very low education rates because it's hard to have like access to education. School is very expensive, and it's getting more expensive because Fresno State is raising tuition over the next couple years because a lot of the chancellors are like raising their own like income And so a lot of the staff isn't like getting a payment increase, and students are having to bear the burden of those increases. So I myself had to pay probably almost like $4,000 like per semester. And if you can't pay for it, then you're not able to register for classes anymore. So luckily, we did have some resources where I got some scholarships from the Fresno American Indian Health Project where I applied for it. They gave me $1,000. I relied on like a lot of little scholarships to pay it off, and then I had to pay like most of it like out of pocket. And so when you get to a master's program now, it's $6,000. And so a lot of people just don't have that money out of pocket like whatsoever. And I'll give an example just on housing too. I'm trying to like find my own home, and I was working 40 hours a week, 24 an hour. And it was very difficult because I wanted to get like a mobile house, something cheaper than a home. And they said, well, we need an $8,000 down payment. And I'm like, $8,000 down payment? Who has $8,000 for people like around my age? And so it's like it's very like difficult because there isn't much of a support system, and a lot of us come from like low income families. So when it comes to like education or housing, or just trying to like make a better lives for ourselves, there are like so many obstacles. And for us, even like Western institutions kind of like come off as very like cold to us, because the Western perspective is, you need to come to class at this time, and you need to do testing, you need to you have to, how do I say it, memorize like all of these facts. And the thing is, when I took in any indigenous studies course, we never did any tests or anything, because they said, we're not trying to teach you memorization, we're trying to teach you the topic. So your final is you're going to write about what interested you the most. There was literally a time where I was in an indigenous arts class, and they let me read a rap or poem as my final grade. And I took everything that I learned from the class and I integrated it like within like a long poem, and he graded me on that too. And so it's just not kind of understanding like how we view education and what it means to be educated, because academia is very, very slow when it comes to change. So if there's a need there, they don't want to change like whatsoever, because they're like, well, we've been doing it for this long, why do we need to change anything like whatsoever? So those are like just kind of like a few of those barriers that are there, especially even with my own tribe too. We're state recognized, but we don't get like any benefits like from that whatsoever. The only thing we can do as a state recognized tribe is qualify for grants, but like we can't pay for somebody else's education. We can't bring any support like with our tribe whatsoever. And even getting access to language programs, that costs money, and we have to like be more organized. We have to have grants for that. And we're like a smaller tribe too, and we run strictly off of donations. The state doesn't give anything to us. We can register as a 501c3, we can like get like certain services, but we're very like limited. The average tribal member doesn't get any benefits from it, and a lot of people think that if you're indigenous you just get money, and I'm like, that's not how it works.
Wow. So you're mentioning a lot of these gaps and issues, like the lack of higher education courses at Fresno State, due to that limited population size, right? But do
Mhm.
you think using population size to determine kind of that allocation of resources ignores that historical responsibility that governments should have towards indigenous communities?
Yeah, I think it does. I believe it does avoid a lot of responsibility, because, a lot of people estimate that, the population of indigenous people could be like 60 to 100 million. And by the time of the 1890s, that number was around like 300,000, so like a majority of our population was, either killed off like, by disease, like warfare, and, displacement as well. So a lot of us like got moved from our homelands as well, and so that's very like traumatizing for us. And you know it's an example of when a lot of tribes got put onto reservations, they weren't allowed to provide or hunt for themselves anymore, and so they just gave you like lard, sugar, and all these fatty foods. So over the course of like 100 years, it's like now we have a lot of health issues within the Native American community. Like diabetes is a huge thing, cancers are a huge thing. Like I think the life expectancy for indigenous people is like around like 65 or like your mid 60s. It's like very much below the national average. And so because of that generational trauma, and also because a lot of people like me sometimes don't even grow up knowing our culture, because the boarding schools and just the American ideology was assimilation. You need to forget your culture and you need to be American. And so one of the famous quotes from the boarding school was kill the Indian and keep the man. So they just wanted to erase everything about us and they just wanted us to be American. So a lot of people in my family, for example, why a lot of people didn't grow up that way is because a lot of people were killed for being indigenous, like in my tribe in our history. That's why my family fled from Louisiana to the Central Valley because of just the violence that was going on. Like a lot of our family members ended up owning land in Louisiana after the displacement. People found out that we owned land, and so they asked one of our cousins, like he said, you need to sell this land to us. He said no, so the people came back the next day and they gunned him down. So a lot of like the family members are like, we're not going to teach our kids to be native. We're not going to teach them to be indigenous because if we do, he's like, they could be killed or they could like have harm come upon them. So it's like we need to hide that and we don't need to tell them anything about those indigenous roots. They need to lay low and that's it. And we just need to make sure that they're safe. So there's a huge generation of us that never even knew when we were growing up. Like we had to discover later in life. So there's like a lot of history with a lot of different tribes. And there's a reason why like the population, isn't really there. It's like one, the historical part, the deaths, the assimilation, but there's also just like the trauma and the displacement and how cold academia is because some students don't even want to go to college because they're just like, well, why do I have to like integrate with this Western perspective that was never mine to begin with? Why do I need to do this? So there's like a lot of like layers there. And I feel like just say bring in the population, it's a little insulting to me in that sense.
Yeah, and just negligence as far as that responsibility. It sounds like that historical genocide of Native peoples is really continuing to shape social economic conditions of communities today. You're mentioning education, healthcare. I would love to delve into social services as well. As social work majors,
Mhm.
that's definitely going to be our bread and butter. But in your experience, where do you think Western social services, healthcare systems, education, if you want to continue to talk about that as well, but where do you think that those Western systems kind of miss the mark when trying to support Indigenous communities?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that because this is an important one. So, we believe that there's four aspects of health, right? So, we believe that there's your physical health, there's your mental health, and then there is your emotional health. And so, usually, like healthcare, covers those things, but they forget a fourth element that's important to Native communities, which is your spiritual health. And so, when I talk about like Western education and Western views, they don't see spirituality as something that's very relevant to health whatsoever. They don't really talk about that. So when a lot of like native people got to go to healthcare, they do feel like it's very cold because, spirituality is a very important aspect. And I'll give an example of that. Like when we do sweat lodges, for example, it's a very like spiritual thing where they'll bring in like heated rocks and they'll pour water over the rocks and it'll be like a mini sauna. And so they'll sing traditional songs and it'll go on for 4 rounds in total. And the point is that like you're barely able to like breathe because there's so much steam in there, but you're not thinking about any of the issues that were bugging you or any of your resentments because you're so focused on your basic necessities, which is just breathing. And also like, being in ceremony and being around community, those are very spiritual aspects. And I'll give one personally for me. I personally have like a spirit table for my eighth great grandmother, Angelique, who was a translator for my tribe and diplomat and mediator in the late 16, early 1700s. And I feel a very special connection to her. So when I leave an offering or I talk to her or, I share her story to other people, that's very spiritual to me, but it's also very helpful for me in my mental health because I feel like I'm not alone walking through this world, right? And so it's like when you kind of go through the Western institutions of healthcare and all that, it's almost like you have to code switch a little bit because if you talking about ancestors or talking about people who have passed, the idea is some people might think you're crazy or they might see that as a mentally ill or whatever. And that's like something that I've just experienced, not really like so much in healthcare, but with people when I say, yeah, I like to talk to my ancestor, I like to write things. And I'm like, that's delusional. Why are you talking to things that aren't there? That's a immediate reaction like for a lot of people. And I think they need to integrate or allow that spiritual aspect or acknowledge like how important that is, because storytelling is important. Storytelling is a form of record keeping in itself, and I feel like that field doesn't really like respect that as an important element of your health, because you need to be balanced in all four of those aspects in order to become the whole person that you are.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. In Western culture, there is a huge focus and emphasis on the individual. It's really ignoring um, indigenous communities' way of prioritizing family and ancestors. Um, so, can you expand on that a little bit as far as what does healing look like for your community?
Yeah. I think like healing for us is for one, like just being able to like tell like the true history of what has like gone on. Because for example, when they wanted to change like the name of Squaw Valley to Yokuts Valley, immediately there was like pushback, and they said, well, that's not disrespectful, that's honoring. We're honoring with that term. And we're like, we're literally telling you that it's not an honorary term whatsoever, and people will fight back against that, and they're very like uncomfortable with the history. And when we talk about the history, like people get upset, and it's like, why are you getting upset? Because we're telling our truth of what happened. And they're like, well, you guys were killing each other before like colonization ever happened, so whatever. And that's like very angering for a lot of us, because it feels like a lot of people aren't really trying to understand us, or it's like they feel like that, how do I say it, that oh, you're just like thinking about the history or whatever. He's like, things are a lot better now, whatever, whatever. And I'm like, sure, like I will acknowledge that there have been like changes or improvements, but there's still a lot of work to be done. And when I talk about, well, we didn't have religious freedom till like 1978, and some of those acts weren't truly enforced until another act was enforced in the early 90s. And I said, so a lot of us who have gone through boarding schools, or a lot of us who remember when we couldn't practice ceremony legally, there are people that are still alive that experienced that. And so the problem is that a lot of institutions don't even want to mention that whatsoever. A lot of people feel uncomfortable, or they have this idea that, well, we're the greatest country in the world, so whatever else happened or whatever, it's like, it's better now, it's better now, it's all in the past. And for us, it's not really like a past thing. This is something that we're still living with. And so when somebody's not acknowledging a reality that's happening to you, it can be like very hurtful. And I think the healing aspect kind of comes in when you give funding to like indigenous like education within the college system, or when you talk about like just even in like I think in public school too. I think healing that history, like telling that history, especially to the younger people too, so the younger people can grow up and they can kind of become like a more aware of the history. So I think education, knowledge, I think acknowledgement of what had happened. And I just think of sovereignty, and sovereignty is a very big one, because there's a lot of like reservations that have their own jails and have their own police force. But if a non-native person goes onto the reservation, commits a crime, hurts a woman, the tribal police can't prosecute him because he's not like a citizen of the tribe. So essentially, they can detain him for a short amount of time, and then they have to just let them go. And they could have done a very violent crime, and they would just have to let him go, because if they detain a non-native person for too long, that person can sue, and if they get sued, they could lose grants that help their own people. So it's like really like terrible in that sense for a lot of federally recognized tribes, because they can't really protect their own people from like other people coming onto the reservation and hurting others. So I think what that also goes into awareness, but we also need more sovereignty to like govern ourselves, and not have the government or not have other people kind of like telling us how we should handle things at home. I think that's like another very huge aspect. And I think land back is a big one as well. And in terms of like giving like land that is not being used by the federal government back to the tribes. I mean, we've heard about the Klamath like dams like going down for the rivers and those being cleared up. And I think there needs to be more like of a movement pushing forward to allow people to have those government lands. Like I think the tribe should also have like the Alcatraz Island as well, because the Treaty of Fort Laramie that was signed says that any Any land that the government owned that is not using anymore should go to indigenous peoples, because the treaties the government made with a lot of tribes, we consider that the supreme law of the land, and we want those treaties honored. There's a lot of treaties that tribes have signed that have just been pushed to the side. So I think healing also looks like honoring those established agreements too.
Yeah, there is a lot to unpack there. So, yeah, thank you for sharing what healing would look like for your community. I would like to delve a little bit deeper into some of the points that you made as far as knowledge. How would your community define knowledge? Is it something that's found in books? Is it passed down through relationship, through stories? I would also like to hear you expand on some of those traditional practices that you were referring to. But those comments on reparations and sovereignty, I would like to skip to that as well. That's something that we really want to focus on in our project is that power. Who in your community holds the power? Who are the decision makers?
Right. So I could speak a little bit more like on my nation, like specifically. And like I said, we're only a state recognized tribe. So I mean, we have 1,800 enrolled members now, but it only started with about 20 or 30 people when it happened. And so my people never even expected us for us to get to that level. So currently, how ours is kind of ranked is we have like an executive branch and a legislative branch as well. So we currently have our established chief, our acting chief right now. Like we've went through like a lot of infighting in terms of like leadership. So currently, my chief is Brett Anderson right now. The woman in the tribe who adopted me when I first connected, she's like the tribal educator of the tribe. So she handles a lot of like the knowledge and cultural aspects and the storytelling and the history. And so then we also just have like council chiefs as well. And I mean, their roles like are very like broad. They help like establish powwow committees. They help, with things like tribal newspapers and things along those lines. So in my tribe, it kind of goes to the council, the executive division of the chief, and the vice chief, the treasurer. And so we also have an ambassador to France as well, because we had first contact with French people before the idea of America came about, because we've existed for thousands of years. So we have a lot of like connection there. Of course, like in the Central Valley, there are like leadership people who like hold high positions at nonprofits like the Fresno American Indian Health Project that I've brought up like multiple times. There are other nonprofits like California Indian Manpower Consortium that help with workforce development, and so that is owned like by a native woman named like Lorenda. So she like runs that whole company, and so it's like a very diverse thing when you kind of get to California, because like there are so many like there are like there's probably like over 100 federally recognized tribes and like around 88 unrecognized. So leadership can look very different depending on like where you are. But in for my tribe, it's like, through our council and our governments. If you go here, there's like a lot more diverse areas of leadership. Like even becoming a professor at Fresno City College is a leadership position like within that community, because you are like a big figure like within there. Fresno State has people who run like the Native American Studies department, like Dr. Leslie Oliver is one that's like over there, and she helps run a lot of things. Even my own cousin, who's a grant writer for my tribe, she's the vice president of diversity and equity for the University of Oregon. So she makes sure, and she's like has that power to ensure that there's good indigenous representation, and she makes sure that the university gets accredited like every year to continue teaching as an organization. So there is like a lot there, a lot to kind of like break down, and it comes in different levels. I mean, you have tribal leadership, you have councils, and then you have people who are able to gain power within certain institutions to try to open doors for other people.
That is a lot. Yeah. So
Yeah.
explaining further on leadership and power, do you feel Indigenous voices are adequately included in decision making?
Um,
Why or why not?
I would say that I feel like they could be more involved with like the decision making, like for sure. I mean, like even when I was talking about like Fresno State and them essentially like putting a blanket term over everything and calling it interdisciplinary studies, it's like they didn't really talk to the indigenous community like whatsoever. And even when they set up a genocide monument at Fresno State, if you go there, it shows like the genocides like all over the world. And if you look at North America and Canada, it's just blank. And so it's like, well, why wasn't in or why weren't indigenous people like asked about this, or why weren't wasn't our input kind of like brought there? Because it's like some people even have a hard time calling what happened to indigenous people just like a genocide. And I feel like it's like because of those like little things, and also the idea of people don't think we're an established community or we don't exist anymore. I kind of feel like, there needs to be like more awareness, and there needs to be a little bit more representation like for us. So I don't really feel like in terms of decision making, it's not always there. We have to usually like rely on people in positions who are within those institutions to make it happen. And if they're not there, it just won't happen. There was even a recent issue within Clovis where this um, person in the community, her name was Bella, and she wanted to wear her regalia for graduation, high school graduation in Clovis, and they said no. At first, they weren't allowing to do it. So then she had to fight for it, and they said, "Okay, we'll allow you to do it, but you need to fill out a form first." She filled out the form, and they lost the form, quote unquote. And then, yeah, they said, "Oh, we lost it." And then other people were in the school was arguing, saying, "Well, she wears her regalia during graduation. It's going to be a distraction." And I'm like, "A distraction? Like, what are you talking about like whatsoever?" And so the whole community had to come out to talk to them, had to represent them. And then Bella had to go like to like one of the, like the representatives, go like up that like local government level. And then they had to enforce a law that said that it would allow students to wear their regalia for graduation. And this is like all happened last year. This is all very like recent stuff. So, I kind of want to say that we're included, but just from all the examples that I've just seen recently, I don't feel like there is like enough being done to hear our perspective or whatsoever, because they straight up said no, and they didn't even want to listen to, some of like our elders or some of the elders in the community. And every time they tried to talk to the principal would seem annoyed and just like disinterested in the whole conversation. Like they didn't want to do it, and they made a whole big deal out of it. So it was a struggle, but luckily that law got passed and she could, wear her regalia. But her and like the community had to fight for a good year and a half just to get that through. So I think there could be so much more.
Yeah, it sounds like there is a lot of ignoring Native voices or not considering Indigenous community in making those decisions. So from your perspective, what would that decision making look like? What does sovereignty, self-determination mean to you in the context of your community or your daily life?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, and this is something I learned even within my own master's program when, we talk about community-based participatory action research. Because many times, like Western researchers will study like a group at a distance, take what they need, and then they'll just like leave. But for Indigenous research, we say that you have to enter a partnership with the community when you do that research. So you meet up with like a lot of the leaders of the community. You tell them, this is what I want to research. This is what I hope to get out of it. And then you also have to include like, what is the tribe going to get from this research? Because not only does the researcher like, of course he needs to benefit, but the community also has to benefit too. And it needs to be a relationship. And the tribe gets full power to decide like, okay, let me overview the research before you put it out. Let's like look at this first before you do that. So sovereignty to me, like in terms of us interacting with Western institutions, it needs to be like an equal partnership, like first and foremost, and it needs to be a respected partnership. And so I think with Indigenous action research, I mean, it goes into like so many, the elements of it go to very, like different levels, because it's that thing where people come into the community all the time. They want to take this information and like leave. And then, they don't even interpret the information the right way, because like, there's a lot of nuance to culture. There's a lot of nuance to Indigenous ways of understanding the world. And so sovereignty to me is, coming to the community, having a discussion with us, and us being equal partners. Like nobody is above anybody here. And I can even give you an example of, there was a researcher doing research about my grandmother, my eighth great grandmother, and somebody like reached out to me because she was studying her, and she wasn't like an official researcher, but she studied my grandmother, and she's like, I didn't know any of her descendants were still alive. And I'm like, what do you mean? She goes, I asked the researcher like researching her and everything, and I said, does she have any descendants? And he goes, I don't know if she has any. And I'm like, what did he mean by that? I said, I'm right here. I said, my tribe is right here. And there have been other researchers that have talked about my grandmother and tried to say that, oh, she may have had a different identity or whatever it is, or they like questioned like the lineage of it, and they never talked to anybody in our tribe about it or any of the descendants. And it's just like kind of an insulting thing because like we're here. The ethical thing would be to come to us if you're going to study somebody in our lineage, come ask our perspective, because the Western perspective may lack a lot of nuance. But if you get our perspective, you combine it with the Western perspective, then you can get a very good worldview of that. And so I think sovereignty often comes from collaboration, but also like reciprocity as well, where both sides can benefit from the thing. But I feel like right now, for the most part, it's like either people don't want to listen to the history, they don't want to allow certain cultural elements, or they just want to take certain things from the community and not really give back to it whatsoever. And I think if more like outside institutions were able to do that, then we wouldn't be dealing with a lot of like the issues we have now. Like there's the disappearing Indian myth where we're all just extinct and we don't exist anymore, or just so many other stereotypes where it's like, oh, they get casino money. I'm like, no, I've never gotten casino money in my life. And I think educational sovereignty is a big one. Governmental sovereignty is a very huge one. Research sovereignty and collaboration is a really big one too. And I think that's what it looks like going forward. And I think people really need to understand. They need to try to understand the history, and they need to listen to the people like within that community, like truly listen and understand that perspective. And a lot of people, for some reason, can't do that because they find it uncomfortable because Western education, like I've said, we are taught that there's only one way to view the world. So to step outside of that can be very difficult for some people. But discomfort is where people grow. Like if you're uncomfortable, then you got to ask yourself why you're uncomfortable. And if you avoid it completely, then you're not going to grow as a researcher, you're not going to grow as a leader, and you're not going to grow as a person. So we have to be able to have those difficult conversations too.
Yeah, absolutely. In social work, our research really emphasizes that reciprocity, community partnership. But that is due to, just like so many other things that we've had in this conversation, that is due to a lot of historical injustices that our field has committed against peoples and populations that we have studied in the past. So, how can researchers, social workers, acknowledge and respect community relationships?
Yeah, I mean, I think for one, like when I say like coming into the community in a good way, like you ask people like how do they feel about this research. You talk to like a lot of the leaders in the community. You get to, and I think also like just being around the community too. Like if you go to like attend the powwows or maybe like just like community gatherings or something. I think that's like a big part because the way a lot of indigenous people will educate you, they're not just going to sit you down and say, well, this is what this is and this is what this is. They're going to immerse you in it. They're going to say, I'm going to show you a few things, but you're going to be they might like take you to a gathering, or they might just kind of like show you through lived experiences rather than just like directly like lecturing you. And I think you really have to like be open about that. You have to be open about being around community members and getting like to know people, because it's just the thing where we've had so many outsiders like come in and take advantage of us. So naturally, like we're going to be kind of like distrustful of institutions like when they come in. A lot of them have been like traumatized by research, and it's just you have to kind of be aware that there is that trauma and there is that fear there. So even if like you might feel like it's standoffish or kind of cold, it's not anything personal. It's just that there's trauma that a lot of us have inherited. And it's like if you come in a good way, you demonstrate that you're in a good way by genuinely trying to learn, like asking questions and being very upfront and honest about your research, like, and your purpose. And if you can do that, then the community will be more than happy to like collaborate and work with you. But it's going to be an ongoing process of building trust, and that's just going to take time. So anybody, even within that work field, you have to be patient with those things, because even in the medical field, like a lot of them don't like going to the doctor's office because feel like sometimes the doctors are rude, or there's like no community connection there. It's very business like, very individualistic like, and that makes a lot of people just uncomfortable to begin with. So also just be very wary, or like be very aware of like what you say before you say it too, because sometimes like things like people just say randomly can be insensitive, or can be like very hurtful. Like there was even a time where someone wanted to set up a sweat lodge at like Argona camp, and they're like, well, why don't you just move it over there? That would be better. And he got like pissed off, because it's like, how are you going to tell me as an indigenous person how to set up a sweat lodge and like where to do it? And I'm not saying like the person had any ill intention whatsoever, but you have to be very like aware, be very aware of like what you're saying and how you're saying it, because it's like I said, the trauma kind of can easily make you interpret something as aggressive, or what are you trying to do. So I would say that, I would say, be involved, but also like do a lot of research about the history of the people that you're going to talk to, and be aware of like what they had gone through, and that'll help kind of like prepare you for what's to come.
Okay, yeah, thank you for that. Just given that history of exploitation of broken promises, it sounds like having that knowledge, that historic, cultural humility is really important for people in my field when interacting with that community. But I know you touched on knowledge a bit again, so can you go into that? Who would you say are the knowledge keepers in your community?
The elders are the knowledge keepers. Like we consider them like living, breathing, walking records, especially. And that is like the very sad part when it came to like colonialism, because when the boarding schools happened, they disconnected us like from our elders, and when a lot of elders started dying or getting very sick, it's like once they pass away, that's it. And if like kids are taken away and brought to another school, the elders are over here and they don't have access to healthcare and they're passing away, that destroys like a lot of knowledge, and so the purpose of being an elder is like when you get to that stage of life is to teach that next generation. And we believe and there's a seven generations philosophy by the Haudenosaunee people, and they believe that every time we make a decision, we must make a decision hoping that our decision will benefit the next generation, seven generations down the line. A lot of politicians don't even think about tomorrow, honestly, and so that is like a really like big part of it. So when elders talk, we listen. If they tell traditional stories, we listen to it, because they're kind of teaching us without teaching us in a sense. They just might tell us something like very interesting, and we remember those stories. And so when we take our place as elders, it's our responsibility to teach that next generation. So there is a lot of like very huge respect there for a lot of people. I have elders like in my tribe as well that I always ask questions and I learn, because stories, I've learned like a lot of stories from the oral tradition too. And so stories like that also act as record keeping. And if you look at it, there's been for the indigenous people in Hawaii and tribes like in Southern California, and they'll talk about like a geological event happening within an oral tradition story, and they'll talk about a volcanic eruption. And so scientists looked at the story and they found out when the story was possibly dated, and they discovered that a volcano did erupt during that time period. So sometimes that oral tradition is like sometimes more accurate than the Western science aspect of it. But we get all of that from elders in the next generation. We get language from that next generation. And that's why like we rely on a lot of elders today in a lot of tribes where, they're part of the language revitalization programs. There was a language revitalization program for a different band of Caddo in Oklahoma, and they were learning a lot from the elders. Unfortunately, when COVID-19 happened, a lot of them passed away, and our last like fluent speaker passed away last year. So, we're trying to gain like whatever recordings and information to try to bring that sleeping language back. But yeah, no, they carry a lot of things. It's like those who learn from the past will be able to, benefit the future too down the line.
Yeah, that is amazing to hear about just some of those community strengths and assets. And I would like to pivot into that. There's a lot of challenges, and while those are really important for us to understand, I think it's just as important for us to highlight the strengths that exist within that community. Casey?
Um, So, what strengths, resources, or support systems help sustain and strengthen Indigenous communities?
Yeah, I think what has been our major strength through everything, through the genocides, through the boarding schools, through all these things, is kind of like just our spiritual connection, like to Mother Earth, and seeing everything in a relationship. So, for example, like um, a lot of people like who don't have like an indigenous sense of seeing the world, like when we see an animal or we see like plants or whatever, we don't see that as a relationship whatsoever. We see that as an object devoid of life. We are not part of that whatsoever. So a lot of people like forget that, like we're living in nature right now. Just because we're living in a home or just because we live in a city, nature, we're constantly in relationship with nature. But a lot of people establish it as oh no, nature is a place you go to visit. We're separate from that. And so Native people have always understood that we are not separate from nature. We are simply a part of that cycle. We are part of that circle. And we see time as very like cyclical in nature too. So many people say beginning, middle, and end. We see like birth, life, death, and rebirth. And so we understand that, nothing ever truly dies. It simply like changes form. And so I'll give an example. Like in my history with the Caddo people, we were agriculturalists. We were semi-sedentary. So we lived in relationship with the land and saw it as a relative. So when we planted agriculture, we did soil rotation so we wouldn't kill the soil. If populations grew, we would like spread out instead of like converging together in one mega city, because when you do that you put strain on the land. And so because we saw it as somebody, as a relative that we lived in balance with, we were less likely to abuse it or exploit it or take all of its resources. Now we have a lot of exploitation of the environment, through the oil industries and so many other extractive industries right now. And we do that because it's like, well, that's not even a relative. That's just something that we take from. And so that is something that has very much kept us grounded, even for a lot of us who grew up disconnected or don't know our language. They could never take away our connection to the land itself. And so that has like kept us like grounded, but it also like got us through some of the most toughest moments of that time, because even when we weren't allowed to do religious practices whatsoever, a lot of the practices didn't disappear. They simply went underground. We were simply doing it like kind of like hiding in plain sight, or we were doing it where, maybe the government wouldn't be able to see us for a time. And I think that element is like that spiritual connection that has really like kept us grounded. And we have this thing called the term all of my relations. So it doesn't matter, where you're from or whatever. We see like another human being as a relative. And so I could like visit other tribes, me myself, I'm not a California native. I'm a Louisiana native, but people over here in this community, to them, that doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter if you're not a California native. You're doing a lot of good work for the indigenous community at large. So even for me, it's like I'm doing my work not just for the Caddo Natchitoches people. I'm doing it for all indigenous people in Canada and the Americas and Mexico, South America, the indigenous people of Hawaii, the indigenous people of Australia as well, even the indigenous Maori people of New Zealand. It's like all of those people like are our relatives type of thing. And so I think that unity across indigenous nations is what also keeps us very strong, because even though our histories, like we have very unique histories, we all have interconnected struggles, and we all have dealt with colonialism all collectively too, and we're very much aware of that. And because we have so much awareness of history, that's another thing that keeps us grounded, because we know that a lot of the systems in place aren't right. We're like, oh no, this isn't right. This isn't how our people lived. We've existed for thousands of years, like our only the last like 400 or 500 years of our existence has been colonialism. And we remember a time before colonialism ever. So we remember, and when I say remember, I'm saying like we know our history so well that we can imagine a world without colonial structures or all of these Western structures. So that allows us to be like, oh, this isn't the only reality. Just because we live in this reality right now doesn't mean it's the only reality. Our ancestors lived in a very different one. So when we think of solutions, we think of bringing like elements of the past to the present to create a future. And learning from the past doesn't mean repeating the past. It just means evolving. Like, what can we do now to like bring these future traditions or whatever, we bring it to the present and we involve it with the times that we are on. Because ceremonies do evolve, certain things like practices evolve over time. The past isn't like, we're not really trying to stay stagnant. We're trying to honor the past, be here for the present, and make sure there's a path for the future too. And we're always thinking about the future as well, and that's what makes us very strong.
I like your perspective a lot. I'm enjoying really am enjoying listening to everything you're saying. It's really interesting. So I have a tiny little connection to the indigenous people. Or sorry, I have a tiny connection. My grandma is like one fourth. Anyways, so it's really interesting just hearing a different a perspective about it.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, Shane, I wanted to ask about that connection to the land, to the local environment. You already jumped on that, sharing so many different strengths. Are there any particular traditions, cultural practices, or if you want to delve deeper into some of those relations or family systems, just briefly? I know we're already
Yeah.
keeping you long
No, you're
time, longer.
good. I'm enjoying this. Yeah, so like you mentioned systems, and I'll mention something very interesting. For my tribe, and a lot of tribes operated like this, but my tribe operates from a matrilineal system. And what that means is, before colonization, we would trace our lineage through our mothers, not our fathers. So a lot of like people in my tribe, a lot of women had power in my tribe. So when I speak of my eighth great grandmother Angelique, she was a possible daughter of like a leader or a chief, and she held a great amount of power for that time. So she spoke Spanish, French, and the traditional Caddo language because those are the colonial people that we had contact with, and my people were known as very skilled like diplomats. And so as a woman, she held like a lot of power, and she had to negotiate with a lot of like colonial soldiers, French soldiers, Spanish priests, and she learned from them. She went to Mexico and she learned how to speak Spanish, and she learned of culture, and she even allowed herself to be baptized, not because she was becoming Catholic or Christian, but she's like, if I do this, this will open doors and they'll allow them to like trust me a little bit more, and I can negotiate on behalf of like my own people. And so she immersed herself in different cultures while protecting her very own. So women play like a very pivotal role because in other tribes where, a man could be appointed as like a chief, but the clan mother, if he doesn't do a good job, the clan mother can just remove him like that. And women were very much like respected in those cultures, and women still are very much like respected in a lot of our tribes and in a lot of our traditions, and they hold like a lot of power. I'll tell you kind of an interesting but funny fact is that in my wife's tribe, she says that it's like, oh no, like the women don't dance because we're already considered too powerful. And I laugh about that. I was like, oh man, I said that is wild. And I'll talk about something that's kind of like more of a general kind of like ceremony, but we call it smudging, where we grow our own sage and we use that as like a tool to cleanse. And so kind of like what we do there is like we go there to pray to get rid of negative energies, and we pray on our own way, and we also do tobacco offerings, and we consider tobacco very sacred because we consider it a gift from Creator Himself. So offering tobacco is almost like walking between the physical world and the spiritual world. And it is also a way to like send prayers, back up to the spirit world as well. So, I recently like I was at like a funeral for like one of my cousins 2 weeks ago. And so after, they buried her, I got some of like my own tobacco that was gifted to me from like the Mono community. And I sprinkled like tobacco and I said like, prayers. And I'll tell you about like specifically my mourning process for my tribe is that we believe that you leave items for the person who had passed away so they can take those items like to the spirit world. So I was talking to like my tribal mother, the woman who adopted me, and I said, so does that mean like you leave like weapons or something like that? And she goes, no. She goes, we like to think that the spirit world is a very peaceful place. So, so we'll leave like little items for them like tobacco or, certain things. And, there's like a mourning process as well, where it's very common for when someone passes away, you cut some of your hair off too. And so early on, when my grandparents passed away 5 or 6 years ago, I actually cut off like most of my hair, and then I burned my hair. And I did that to like mourn because like long hair is considered an extension of your nervous system. And so like you do that in a way to kind of like, numb yourself like for the grief for a time, but it's also like out of like respect too, to like mourn that person like properly. And so like, when you're mourning and everything, you're supposed to be sober. You're not supposed to drink or smoke or anything like that. And it's just a thing that like you're choosing to sit with that grief so you can heal from that grief. And that's just like a couple like smaller practices. A lot of other practices though, it's like naming ceremonies and things along those lines. Those things are like very like private type of stuff. And so usually it's just because a lot of the people who do those kind of ceremonies, they have to do a lot of very like extreme like preparations. They do have to like, kind of like put a lot of strain on their body for it. Some people will fast like to do that. But the official details of what goes on, that's really considered private knowledge, like for the tribe itself. So sometimes even when you research, you're not going to get all that information because that information isn't meant for institutions. It's meant for just like the tribe itself.
Yeah, so some of those close practices, yeah, I would love for you to talk about that. But also, for us as social workers, how do you think any non-Indigenous people can or should they respectfully approach learning about or engaging with some of these more close practices?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing is like always ask, and talk to people about how these ceremonies work. And you're like, so what am I allowed to understand? And it's like, what is like strictly like specifically for the tribe? And like a lot of them will be like very like direct, and they'll like pretty much like tell you that, yeah, like you can know about this element, what we do to like prepare for it, or what we do to engage with this. He's like, but in terms of like actual ceremony, like specific details, like there's things we can't really talk about. And also like filming is a big one. So there's like there's some ceremonies that you are allowed to like film, of course, like like taking videos like at powwows or whatever. If you ask, I would always like ask first with anything. But when we're talking about like very like even like marriage ceremonies or certain cleansing ceremonies or whatever, it's like you're not really allowed to take pictures or take videos because those things are like very private. Even when some people come to like a powwow, it's like you don't just walk up to someone and take a picture of them type of thing. Like, if they're out like dancing or whatever, like some people take videos or they take little pictures all the time. But if you want to take a picture of like a specific person, like, oh, I love your regalia or whatever, you just ask and you say, hey, like, can I take that picture? Of you and your regalia. Is that okay? Can I do that? And it's just like very much just like checking in. And so, you know, just like certain like ceremonial items, of course, take pictures of, and it's just kind of like how do I say, asking, because sometimes we have gona and we have like a spirit table, or we have like a medicine table where we have like traditional medicines, and sometimes like that traditional medicine area is there, and we might be doing activities and that might appear in the background, certain things. It's very much like you kind of have to really ask about protocol, and you have to talk to the people that are there and saying, can I take pictures? What am I not allowed to like record? And is like, am I allowed to attend these things? Because like non-native people can attend like sweat as well. Like there are certain things, like some people think that certain everything is just simply exclusive to native people. And I say, no, you can go to a powwow. It's like you can ask about like, going into sweat. I said, you just have to be respectful when you go there. And, you need to kind of like, abide by like the norms that we have like set up. But overall, it's like I said, it's just really about like checking in and asking questions and making sure that you are respectful about it.
Thank you. And I appreciate your insight into that greatly. But part of this assignment, we're asked to conduct surveys, create asset maps, walking tours of communities, and engaging in creative assessments such as photography, music, dance.
Mhm.
So yeah, definitely if we're going to move forward, I think we should ask the community for that. Right before this interview, I was looking into some of the tribal government websites for our local communities. And Casey, I was just about to email you. Look at these great websites that I found. They have all sorts of media that we can use in our presentation, all sorts of videos that maybe we could put clips in. And I don't want to just do that after you've kind of expanded on that. So I think learning that is going to really help us with this project and just in our social work practice in the future as well. And just make sure that, like you said with researchers earlier, that we are not just taking, that it is reciprocal and that it is respectful. So I will definitely make that effort to check in before I go and snatch some of those, YouTube videos. So thank you for that. And so now I would like to move on a little bit, and we're not going to keep you too much longer. I appreciate you sharing your perspectives so much. But let's see. So, community tenor is something that we are supposed to hit in this project as well. So, thinking about the outlook, the overall outlook within the Indigenous community, how would you describe the emotional climate of your community? So, for example, do you feel like a majority of people are hopeful? Are they resilient, frustrated, empowered, or something
Yeah,
else?
I mean, I think it's a mix of things. I definitely feel like, there definitely is like a lot of hope there. And I say that because I see like a lot of people who are like going in to get an education. And I'm not just talking about like the professors and the people already there, but I've like worked with like a lot of people. A lot of like indigenous students have attended college with me. I've attended a lot of some classes with people there. And so one of them wants to do like a language like project to kind of like get the mono language a little bit more like established and like kind of like teach language games. And so I know people who are also like who are actively like doing that. Um, I also they started the I believe the Indigenous like Scholar Society too. That was actually revived during I think my last semester at Fresno State, in which like a lot of like the 4.0 students like would all meet up together and they would just talk about like what they want to see from the curriculum at Fresno State like in the future. And so it was wild because like that was there for a moment and then it just kind of like fell through, and so somebody brought it back, and I saw a lot of indigenous scholars that were like 3.0 4.0 students. And so there is like a change occurring. A lot of like the newer generation and people my age are starting to like start like getting our feet through the door. I mean, a lot of us are still finishing that educational process, but we're already doing like the work in the community. So I think for the younger people, it's just we want opportunity, to display and show what we understand and what we know. And especially like even for me, it's like, man, I kind of hope I get that professor position because it's like I know I can do good. I want that chance. And it's like there is frustration there because we got to work within like a lot of Western systems, even within nonprofits. Nonprofits want numbers. So oftentimes if like kids get involved, it's like, okay, we need to do a sign up form, we need to like do a roll call thing and list everybody who is in this session. And so there's like a lot of pressure within nonprofits too, where it's like, yeah, like the kids are happy and everything. He's like, but we need more numbers because we need these numbers to get funding from this grant or whatever it is. So it's like we can't really always focus on like just the pure happiness of some of them. It's like there's a numbers game to it, there's a funding game to it, and sometimes that gets in the way. And I think the frustration comes within, it's like we're operating within a Western system that was never made for us. We're operating in that system that we never really used or like we don't really like care for, but we have to in order to like get support for other people. And so the frustrating aspect is walking in between two worlds and trying to make the system work for our benefit. And that can be very difficult at times. So even though there is a lot of frustration, people are working like really hard. My wife wants to go into public administration. That's her master's program at Fresno State that she's going to, and she wants to like influence educational policy and like help like benefit like indigenous students a lot more within that educational system. So there are a lot of like people who are like starting to rise up, and more people that I notice that are getting like their education too. And that's going to open a lot of doors for them. So I think there's frustration there. Of course, there's so much work that needs to be done and there's things we're fighting through, but I think at the core of it is hope too, because if we didn't have any hope, we wouldn't really be trying to do anything. And I always say that even though things are terrible, even though the history of what they did to us is terrible, the least that I'm going to do is I'm going to try, and I'm going to try to make a difference. And I think that's a mindset that a lot of people are having right now in the community, and even in the Natchitoches tribe that I'm a part of. It's like we still want to move forward, even though we went through like a lot of like tribal leadership change and drama. There's still that hope of like, no, we're going to continue to move forward. We're going to make sure that our family is better connected. Once everything gets settled, we want to get in our language program. So there's goals there. The frustration is ridiculously real, but there is effort there, and we're not stopping like the fight whatsoever.
That's good. I like how I like all your goals and everything, and I know you're going to accomplish all of this. I know, I know you are. I know it's amazing. Are there Western ways of problem solving that feel uncomfortable or unnatural compared to how your community approaches a challenge?
Yeah, and I think with Western research, as I mentioned, that Western research is always trying to break things down into numbers, and that has been very useful because I mean, mathematics has kind of taught us a lot about astronomy and how the universe works, and so like Western education can give you that numbers exactly how to break things down, all of these other aspects, but they kind of like neglect the relationship aspect of it. And I think that's really like the core of indigenous education is okay, you understand like all these forces in the universe, or you understand nature, but you don't know how to live within nature whatsoever. So we have something called traditional ecological knowledge. And this is knowledge that has been collected over the course of thousands of years with tribes. So I'll give an example of that. There's something called controlled burns. And so the reason why we have so many wildfires, like in California, is because like a lot of tribes like were unable to do controlled burns, and that's when you burn away dead foliage, you burn around like dead trees so you can leave room for new life to grow. And because there's so much dry dead foliage, and tribes weren't allowed to participate, that now what do we get? We get wildfires. When it came to hunting animals, or like hunting like fish or whatever, it's like we wouldn't like kill the babies or anything like that, because it's like you kill the babies or you dismantle the population, you're only going to hurt yourself when it comes to that. And so it's like, you're not going to have food in the future. The next generation is going to struggle very severely. So it's like, what do we do? He goes, well, this is how we do it. We'll hunt the adult fish. We won't overhunt the population. And even like I was told in my tribe in Louisiana, where there's like gators, alligators, I said, would we hunt alligators? And they're like, well, only if like we had a hard time finding food. Other than that, we left them alone. We didn't like mess with those type of things. And people say, oh, that's just spiritual stuff or whatever. I'm like, yeah, there's a spiritual element to it, but it is also a science. And we talk about the three sisters, where it was corn, beans, and squash. Native people grew those elements together, and they would like nourish each other. And like it was an agricultural advancement that we had thousands of years before Europeans. But the idea is that like, oh, we were just primitive people who didn't know any better. And that's the problem with like Western science. It assumes a lot, and it assumes it's like this is the only way that it is. So measurements are good. I'm not like bashing like the overall science of it, because Western science has been useful for certain advancements, but they don't know really how to like live in relationship with it. They don't really know where is our place in this natural world. Where do we stand within the environment? Where do we stand like within the ecosystem? And with the colonial ideology, they think they're at the very top and they just dominate everything. So just a lot of global warming and a lot of the environmental issues that we're having comes from things like deforestation. Oh,
I think his computer might have died.
Yeah,
Yeah.
perhaps.
Yeah, I
Well,
think we kept him too long.
yeah, I know we kept it for so long, but
I
this is
know.
so good.
It's so interesting.
Yeah, we'll wait a little bit longer to see if he hops on. Oh, there he is. Shane, we've kept you
Sorry.
so long that your computer died. Oh, you're on mute.
oh, thank you. Yeah, no, I'll just kind of continue my point real quick. I think I was talking about just like indigenous like education and how it works, and I think like if both Western indigenous ways Western and indigenous ways work together, I think knowledge could become like very well rounded. Because even in science, they say I think there's like a limit to what we can understand in the world and the universe. Like numbers can only take us so far. And I'm like, well, it's like I think that if you added relationship to there, you could get a more nuanced view of the world. Like there's something called seeing the world through two eyes, like the Western and indigenous perspective. And the thing is, they don't have to be in conflict with one another. They can work together. The problem is, it's like I've mentioned that Western ways of education don't want to acknowledge that whatsoever. So it's like us even going into the education system, we have to make our studies sound academic. We have to translate it into like academic verbiage because, you know, if we don't, then they're not going to see it as, oh, that's not knowledge. That's not knowledge whatsoever. And so it also comes with like acknowledging that indigenous people are just as much as educators as the people with degrees. My tribal educator does not have like a college degree whatsoever, but she knows the culture very well, and she goes to other communities and she educates people about indigenous culture. So, in an academic sense, they're like, "Well, she's not an academic," and I'm like, "Well," I said, "maybe not in that Western sense, but she is academic in that indigenous sense too." And I think bridging those two gaps is like really important.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of harm. You mentioned environmental harm that has come from
Mhm.
Western institutions, kind of assuming that their way is best, assuming that their way of managing the land is the best approach, while ignoring indigenous knowledge. And yeah, I think that's kind of the overall theme of this interview is just the importance of not only environmental justice, but recognizing that indigenous knowledge and like you mentioned earlier, kind of forming those community partnerships. I think that's what I'm going to take away from this going forward with my role as a social worker is really making sure that I'm not just demonstrating that cultural humility of learning about a community before I go and practice it or practice with it, but forming those community partnerships and asking the different communities that I'm going to be working in what they would like to see and what they would like to get out of a relationship with a social worker. So thank you so much for really highlighting a lot of these important not only issues but also solutions. And just so we can start to wrap up as well, and then focusing on those solutions and that change. I know you mentioned it a little bit already, but what changes would you most like to see in the future for Indigenous communities and maybe with their relationship with some of these institutions like social work?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the future, one of the things that I've always wanted to see is that I wish that like indigenous studies like would be added to like public schools like nationwide, and like each state can like talk about like the indigenous lands that they are on. Because I learned a little bit about indigenous history in elementary school, but it was very stereotypical. It was like, okay, you're going to be native, so here's a list of native names that sounded very stereotypical. Like pick one and talk about what it's like being in a tribe or something like that. And we talked about the California mission system, but it was more focused on that Spanish, perspective of it, and we didn't really learn too much about what indigenous people like went through regarding that. So I think definitely like a curriculum like nationwide, depending on the state, would be very like just like huge. And I think even having like indigenous people from those tribes like maybe come in and do presentations like for a lot of like those younger kids and maybe even people in high school too, because I think presence is important. Because like the narrative is like I've mentioned so many times, like they don't think we exist anymore, they don't think we exist in the modern day, and that needs to happen in order for like people to see us as human beings. Because like the education system has very much like failed to talk about indigenous people very accurately. So that's something I hope to see in the future is like more conversation and more learning. I would also like to see a lot more sovereignty for indigenous people to have self-determination on where their path is going to go. You know, I do think that police should be able to prosecute any non-native that does commit a crime on a reservation, because that's why we have a missing murdered indigenous women crisis, because it's like we don't really have like the resources or the sovereignty to tackle the problem like we want to tackle the problem. I would also like to see more Native people in different roles. Like for example, I want to see more of them in film roles. I want to see more Indigenous authors published. I want to see like more Indigenous writers get the opportunity because I always say that like for Native people, it's not that we have a lack of talent. There are plenty of talented people like in the community, but we just don't ever get the opportunity to do that, you know. And I think that we need more opportunities just like in so many different areas, education and other forms of work. I think that is a very important. And you know, I just hope that there can be like more respect in the future too, because like when we talk about what had happened, it's like, you know, a lot of people are interpret as, well, you hate America or something like that, or whatever, whatever, whatever. And it's like it's not about hating or not hating. It's just that we've existed before the United States was even an idea, you know, like thousands of years of history. It's like, and we're still here and we still exist. And so it's kind of a thing of, it's like you can't expect us to be like patriotic or, you know, pro this and that, because none of the stuff that has happened to us has ever been acknowledged. And when we say we're sovereign people, a lot of them, like, we're not Americans. I'm Caddo, you know. I don't say I'm American, I say I'm an indigenous man. I'm Caddo. I'm older than that concept, you know, by far. And that's not me like hating on anybody who's like come here or anything like that, but that's just the truth. And I hope that history and the truth, I hope more people can be more open-minded just to hearing it and understanding it. And I think that understanding would go so far, and it would go a long way in like fixing a lot of the issues that we're going through. But the problem is that there's still such a long line of denial that's there, or, you know, it's like we have to go through great efforts just to prove that something happened or prove that this is what happened in our history. So I think even just like more collaboration too, because I acknowledge that, you know, a lot of the things we want to accomplish, it's like we can't do it alone too. You know, we need other community support as well. Like we need people who hold certain like institutions of power, or they have certain privileges that we don't have. Because like I've gotten a lot of opportunities from non-indigenous people. I acknowledge that. I've gotten a lot of that. And that is also decolonial work too. Decolonial work can also be giving Native people a voice in certain spaces. And I've been able to enter certain spaces because of like educators, and not all of them have been indigenous. You know, some of them have been my English professors. Some of them have come from, you know, the Mexican Chicano community as well. So it's like it's all there, and it's like all interconnected. And I think those things are important moving forward.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that insight. It sounds like gaining that understanding would really, like you said, go a long way towards maybe mending that relationship and building that trust. And you're right that change doesn't happen in a vacuum. It does take collaboration, right, to see a lot of these changes. But just the importance of highlighting those indigenous voices when trying to implement that change is something that I think as social workers we really need to emphasize as well. And thank you, Shane, for kind of sharing your goals and vision for the future of your community. I really appreciate that, and I would love to end the interview on a positive note like that. And I'll go ahead and allow Casey to ask our last question, and then we could finally let you go.
Yeah, just one more question to wrap it all up. Is there anything else you think people should understand about the Indigenous community?
Yeah. I guess I would say that probably like maybe just a mix of things, that, you know, we're human beings too. You know, it's like you know, we're people, you know, just like you, type of thing. You know, we're not just something that's relegated to the history. You know, we're not just the stereotypes that they have historically portrayed on like films. It's like, you know, we're people. You know, you can come up and you can talk to us, you can like ask questions, you can do these things. It's like we're not you know, we're not like super like hostile people, so to speak. It's like, you know, we have our traumas and we have our history that happened, but like at the end of the day, it's like, you know, we're human beings like just like you know, you know, we're going to school, we're trying to get an education just like you know, we're trying to better our communities, you know, just like you. It's like we're not stereotypes. We're very much beyond like what has been portrayed. And I think, and I would just want people to know that our reality is like we live with like our relatives, and just because we see things through a different lens or an indigenous lens, that doesn't mean that we're less educated than you. It doesn't mean that like we don't understand things, or we don't have an understanding of the natural world, or we're not primitive people. We have our own knowledge systems, we have our own cultural beliefs that have existed for thousands of years with us, and they're very valuable. So I would just ask people that just because something is different or we have a different worldview does not mean that it's incorrect. There is no such thing as correct or incorrect. It's just like different knowledge systems. And instead of trying to like convert us to the Western way of thinking, or even in terms of religion, it's like you don't need to do that, because we already have something valuable within us, and that doesn't need to change. Instead, it's like let's just have a mutual understanding of both sides without trying to convert one another.
Absolutely. Okay. Thank you so much, Shay. Thank you for sharing your time. That perspective is really going to help strengthen our understanding of the Indigenous communities for this project. So thank you again.
Um,
Yes, of course.
do you mind if we share